Imagine you're a small business owner. Should the government be able to coerce you to express a message you don't agree with? The Supreme Court says no.
We think of free speech as being my ability to say whatever I want. It definitely means that. But it also means you don't have to endorse a message you don't agree with.
On this episode, we're diving into the U.S. Supreme Court decision that sided with a website designer, protecting her right to decide which forms of speech to engage in through her business. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism. I'm your host, Nick Dunn. Today we're joined by Bill Duncan. He's the Religious Freedom Policy Fellow here at Sutherland Institute and our resident expert on all things related to the Supreme Court. Bill, thank you so much for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Well, it's a treat to be with you.
So we're talking about 303 Creative and this case that just came down from the U.S. Supreme Court. And I want to ask you to kind of set the stage for us. First of all, what was the legal and constitutional question that was at the core of the case, and why did the court end up siding with the website designer?
Sure. Well, the thing that may be interesting to people is the name of the case, 303 Creative. That's the name of a business. It's a single individual who owns this business, and she has a graphic design and website creation business. So it's artistic in the sense that she's putting some of her own creativity into the product. As she's considering adding a different element to her work, that element is website designs for weddings. And but the challenge for her is that Colorado law requires, Colorado law, like most states, forbids business owners from discriminating against people because of their race, because of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, other categories. And she believed correctly that the state of Colorado would interpret that law to say that if someone came to her and said, hey, we want you to create a wedding video for us, a wedding website for us, that and it was a same-sex couple, she would have to do that. Now, in her specific circumstance, because of religious belief, she said, I'm not uncomfortable doing that. I'm happy to serve anybody who comes to me, regardless of race, gender, sexuality. I have no concerns with any customer on the basis of who they are. But that particular message is just a little bit further than I'd want to go. And she has similar feelings about promoting atheism or whatever. So she went to the Colorado court system and said, I want you to clarify, I feel like this law is going to impinge on my ability to practice my religion, but also to kind of say what I want to say, exercise free speech. And the Colorado courts agreed with her interpretation. And then as the case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court eventually took it to clarify what does the Constitution require in this particular case.
I want to dig into that distinction between providing a service versus refusing service to an individual based on their immutable characteristics. But before we really dig into that, just your gut reaction, did the court get it right?
I think the court did. The core message from the court's decision is that if a person is asked by the government or required by the government on pain of some kind of penalty, a fine or whatever, to express a message they don't agree with, that violates the right of free speech, which of course makes sense to us. We think of free speech as being my ability to say whatever I want. It definitely means that. But it also means you don't have to endorse a message you don't agree with, right, as well. And you imagine the famous story about the communist workers, and I can't remember what nation, Czech Republic, I believe. They had to put up a sign saying, workers of the world unite. Well, what if you just don't agree with communism? In that case, they didn't have that freedom. In the United States, we'd say, hey, no matter what the government says, I don't want to endorse it, and I'm going to forbear doing that.
So it seems like at the core of this case was an issue of speech and expression.
Correct.
And so going back to that distinction between a business saying that, look, we will serve anyone, right, regardless of their orientation, gender, any of these kinds of things, which actually Lori Smith of 303 Creative states that.
Right.
She says, I'll serve anybody. But the issue is the message, the distinction between, but I won't provide a particular service that is expressive in nature.
Right.
And that seems to be the distinction. And it gets to, I want to quote Justice Gorsuch in the majority, because this essentially illustrates what you said. Can a state force someone who provides her own expressive services to abandon her conscience and speak its preferred message instead?
Right.
And that, if that's the core question, seems the answer is no in this case. To play devil's advocate for a little bit, and also to kind of preempt some of the negative reaction to this case that we've seen online and in the news. Imagine it's the 1960s, and if somebody says, I have a deeply held personal belief that they don't want to serve Black customers, right, and they say, well, it's a deeply held religious belief. I think there are some folks on this issue saying, well, is this going to lead to that? Is this opening the door for that? What do we say to them?
And the answer is no. That reprehensible belief is still illegal. The belief is allowed. Of course, anybody can believe whatever horrible thing they want to, but they can't deny people their access to basic services as a result of that belief. And it's really important to understand that from the very beginning of this case, I hope I don't go in the weeds too much here, but as a case develops like this, particularly when there's not a lot of dispute about what's going on, just about what the legal principles are. The two parties, in this case, the state of Colorado and the website designer, are going to agree that certain principles are this is kind of what's at stake in this case. And so from the very beginning, she said, I'm absolutely willing. Any customer that comes in and says, I want a t-shirt design, or I want whatever, she doesn't care about any characteristic that person has. But going a little further, right, and as you've kind of described, she just draws the line when someone asks her to do something that goes against her beliefs. And the good thing to think about is that this applies to anybody. I mean, this would be if the Supreme Court opinion mentions this. If someone's asked to endorse a message that's reprehensible to them because they're gay, they also are protected by this decision, which is good.
So let's read from the majority opinion articulating that point that you just said. And the opinion says, taken seriously, that principle would allow the government to force all manner of artists, speechwriters, and others whose services involve speech to speak what they do not believe on pain of penalty. The government could require an unwilling Muslim movie director to make a film with a Zionist message, or an atheist muralist to accept a commission celebrating evangelical zeal, so long as they would make films or murals for other members of the public with different messages. Equally, the government could force a male website designer married to another man to design websites for an organization that advocates against same-sex marriage. So the court is essentially saying that, look, the idea that the government can coerce you to engage in a service that is expressive in nature, if we apply that across the board, it could lead to all kinds of outcomes that the vast majority of folks would not support. And so I want to see if there's a way to back into, so to speak, what is the consistent principle that comes from this ruling that can be applied to these kinds of issues moving forward? What is the standard that no matter what the characteristics are of the people involved or the beliefs are of the people involved, what is the consistent principle that ought to guide us moving forward?
Well, the way I would think of it is that the consistent principle is the government can't compel a person to endorse a message that they disagree with. It's interesting, as you read the opinion, there's a series of cases. The court doesn't always describe in a lot of detail the cases they're relying on from the past, but knowing a little bit about those cases, you're going to see things like the most interesting case to me is one where there were Jehovah's Witnesses students, children, who didn't want to salute the flag during World War II. So it's a pretty contentious time. I mean, a lot of patriotism, reasonably, and there was concern that they're unwilling to be patriotic and salute the flag. The Supreme Court was doing something pretty brave at that time to say, look, whatever you think about the underlying position they have as part of their religion, they can't be forced to endorse something they just don't agree with, even if the rest of us think that that's exactly right. And the key, I think, for understanding why this is valuable for everyone is we all at some point are going to hold some opinion that may be out of step with the majority, and specifically in this case with the government. And we think that we know that the government should remain neutral in terms of asking us to endorse things that we may or may not agree with. And so if we protect that principle for religious people, in this specific instance, we are also protecting it for non-religious people. And it's kind of interesting in a lot of ways that this line of cases began. We call it the government compelled speech doctrine. that this idea of the government can't compel speech began with a very controversial at the time religious group just asking to be able to kind of withhold their endorsement of a government message. But now everybody benefits from that, whether it's animal rights, whether it's religious freedom, whether whoever wants to can act on their beliefs and decline to send the government's message.
There's something at the heart of this. We have to go to a break soon. We appreciate so much your analysis and expertise, Bill. But the heart of this idea of this consistent principle being applied to all kinds of circumstances with people of different beliefs, backgrounds, orientations, and whatnot. That consistent rule is in some ways the way that this works, the way a pluralistic society has to function. And in our next segment, we talk with a couple of folks about how that sort of spirit of accommodation actually flows from this ruling and then can impact future policy debates around these kinds of issues and our conversations with each other. So we'll get into that in the next segment. But Bill, I want to thank you so much for joining us again here on Defending Ideas and sharing your expertise about this court decision.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be right back after this break. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org. Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nick Dunn. We've been talking about the U.S. Supreme Court decision in the 303 Creative case. We've got a couple of guests to talk through some more details on the surrounding issues. But first, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to the podcast and find clips that you can share, as well as links and more information to what we're talking about today. That's defendingideas.org. So we're joined now by the Reverend Dr. Marian Edmonds-Allen. You are the executive director of Parity, a New York City-based nonprofit that works kind of at the intersection of faith and LGBT issues, and also joined by Derek Monson, who's a vice president of public policy here at Sutherland. Thank you both for joining us on Defending Ideas.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we want to continue our conversation about the court decision around 303 Creative, but expand the lens a little bit into some of the broader issues. But first, I really want to get kind of the gut reaction from both of you, and maybe starting with you, Derek. Did the court rule correctly, and why?
I think to really get at that question, there's a couple of important questions you have to think about first, and that are about deeper issues than what the legal questions the court was addressing. So one is, what does free speech and religious freedom really mean? Are they does it mean the ability to express your deeply held views, be they religious, moral, otherwise? So is a question that yes or no? And the court was trying to get at that. And in this case, they answered yes, that it is what it means. You have the right that is protected by the Constitution to express your beliefs in public and private in various forms. A second question is, what does non-discrimination mean? Are you required to check your constitutionally protected rights in any scenario where there's a non-discrimination law at play? And the court, in that case, answered no. We can have both constitutionally protected rights, like, free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, other constitutional rights, along with non-discrimination protections for protected groups. And because the court answered both those questions, in my view, the right way, is the way I've explained, I do agree with what they did, because I think they forwarded what we all really deep down want, which is a society where we can live peaceably together, having different views, having different backgrounds, different characteristics, that those things don't just get thrown to the floor simply because a particular law is in play or because particular political arguments it's being had. And so I think they made the right decision.
Marian, what's your take on this from the perspective of the court answering those kind of principle-based questions first, as Derek articulated? Is that the right way to approach these issues? I mean, we see these things so often blow up on social media and in the mainstream press. They get very contentious, which is understandable because these are substantive issues that affect people's lives. But do you think Derek's accurate that if we can get folks to step back for a second and say, okay, what are the grounding principles that I need to understand first, or those questions I need to answer that will allow the foundation from which I can understand questions like this specific case where there might be some very important competing values?
I think that Derek is exactly right. And I will say that it's difficult when it's a tender issue like this one. So for me, I am married to my wife. Today is our 10-year anniversary.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So when I think about this case, I think about how tender it is to me, because as a religious person, the sacrament of marriage is tremendously important to me. And as a person who's in a same-sex couple, I also know how hard it's been to get that legal right. That said, I do believe that the court made the right decision, because no one should be forced to say things that are against their religious beliefs.
I want to ask for each of you, from your respective areas of expertise, the work that you both do, kind of the professional spaces you focus on, what does this court decision mean moving forward? Whether it's policy discussions or how we interact with one another in each of your respective areas, how do you interpret it? Okay, this is what it means for me and my professional sphere moving forward, and how can other folks interpret it? What does this mean for that balance of free expression, free religion, and other rights in our society? Marian, how do you take this decision moving forward?
Well, I think about the fact that people on both quote unquote sides of this issue are more riled up about it, to say it that way. Because for some LGBT advocates, what I'm seeing in an immediate reaction is, oh no, LGBT civil rights have been gutted. And that's the reaction that we're going to see in the media. And on the religious freedom side, it's okay, well, good, kind of a sigh of relief. We're not going to be forced to say things against our religious beliefs. But on the ground, which is where I do a lot of my work, I know that we're going to see increased distress by LGBT individuals, by their families, by religious folks who love LGBT people or who are LGBT, like me. I'm an LGBT pastor, and about 50% of LGBT folks identify as being religious too. So this is a very complicated issue. And what it means for me in my work is that approaching it with love with folks on all sides and listening deeply to their cares and concerns around these issues are going to become more and more important.
I want to get more into detail as far as how we have these kinds of conversations and the way that you just articulated, and I think a really compelling way. But first, Derek, I want to get your take as well on moving forward on the issue of religious freedom, of rights. How is this balanced moving forward, maybe from a policy perspective and kind of the area that you work?
Well, I think it's important that we recognize there are different arenas where you can find this balance. The court, to its credit, has tried to do this in most of these kinds of decisions in the recent past and then the further past. Protecting people from extremes in either case, extreme interpretations of religious freedom, extreme interpretations of other kinds of rights. But also trying to, when the case isn't an extreme one, finding this kind of balance, like I think they did in this current decision. Saying this decision is not going to determine whether a same-sex couple can find a wedding website. They're going to be able to find that, and they should be able to find that. It's not going to undermine same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage is healthy as it was before, and is available as it was before, in terms of like getting a license and things. But what it does say is there's a balance there for people of faith or people who have different views about speech when it comes to weddings and the things being created that have a speech element to them in weddings. And that's something that Sutherland's been trying to promote for years now, is finding this right balance. And if you don't like how the court handled it, the solution isn't actually more lawsuits. The solution is get into the legislative arena where you can actually find better balances to these tough questions of competing rights. You can find compromise that allows us to protect everyone. And Utah has done that actually with the Utah Compromise, and at the federal level, they've been doing this as well with the Respect for Marriage Act. So finding these balances happens in the legislative space, not really the judicial space, where their job is to select who wins and who loses. And that means if that's where you're focusing, you're going to lose sometimes. And nobody enjoys that, right? And so the solution then is finding legislative solutions to these things, which means, again, it means compromise, but that is really where the only way to move forward on all these issues is, and to actually protect everyone rather than, creating systems that discriminate against people.
We need to take a quick break in a couple minutes, but I want to ask about the idea of a religion. That I think sometimes folks forget that it is still a protected class. And this was a case where you essentially have, in principle, two protected classes, and their respective rights were trying to be balanced by the court case. So can either of you talk about that in terms of, if we as a society, the way we have these kinds of debates, can remind ourselves that religion is still something that is valuable in the public square. Marian, you've done amazing, tremendous work in that space. And Derek, as you've alluded to, Sutherland, that's something that we do here regularly. But also creating accommodations for people to be able to live their lives and access the services that they're looking for. So can you help articulate for folks why it's important to remember that both of these things are protected classes, and how should that filter into how we understand this issue and how we discuss these kinds of issues moving forward?
Yeah, I think part of that gets back to that question I said earlier. What does non-discrimination mean? Non-discrimination, like you said, protects various groups, including religious individuals and institutions. And so are we creating a non-discrimination system through court rulings that effectively discriminates against a particular group among the protected groups, whether it's people based on their sexual orientation or people based on their religious faith? And again, the reality is, which is what the court showed today, is you don't have to make that kind of, frankly, terrible decision to have to discriminate against one or the other. You can recognize when there's a context of people are still able to access the services and things that they need and they want, you can protect other people who have different types of views. And that's really what our system is designed for. And that's a system really we all want. You think about your neighbors and in your communities. I don't think anybody wants to live in a place where, their own views are just shunted to the side, and if they ever express them, they're going to get in trouble. That's not what really America's about, and that's not what, again, at just a day-to-day level, people want. They want to give others their space and have space for themselves, and that's part of what this ruling did today.
Marian, is that the right balance, especially from a policy debate standpoint? Is that the framework we should use moving forward?
I completely agree, and I think it does need to be legislative. As Derek said, the judicial system creates winners and losers. But as Americans, we can work together, and we've seen that in Utah. We've seen that with the efforts around the Fairness for All Act, and we've seen that around the Respect for Marriage Act. So we can do this, and we need to do this. All of us need to step up and be part of it.
Yeah, I mean, one way to say it, we don't want a discriminatory non-discrimination law, and the court pushed that away today.
So when we come back, I want to get into how we apply that. We've been talking about it in the public policy space. What does that mean for the conversations we're having? And especially for our listeners, how can we equip them with the ability to say, well, I support free expression and religious freedom. I also want our society to accommodate people who may disagree or may be seeking different things in the marketplace. So I want to articulate how we can have those conversations when we come back and get into what we can provide for our listeners to be able to have better, more productive conversations that are still holding true to the ideas that they're trying to defend. So we're going to take a quick break. We've been talking about the Supreme Court decision on the 303 creative case. You're listening to Defending Ideas. We'll be right back. For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org. Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nick Dunn. Before we get back into our topic today on the Supreme Court ruling on 303 Creative, I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, any of the preferred podcast providers, as well as find clips that you can share and also links to more information and analysis about what we're talking about today. As we dive into this issue of the Supreme Court case, and really what it means for each of us. We've been talking with Marian, Edmonds-Allen, and Derek Monson. I want to shift from kind of a policy focus. We've talked about what does this mean for public policy in the future, for debates about weighing various rights in the public square. But what does it mean for each of us? What I mean by that is, how can we have conversations with folks in our circle where we are better at articulating, here's the principle that I believe and why I think it's important, but doing so in such a way that the other person will not be scared away, essentially. How do we reduce the polarization around this? And maybe to start with you, Marian, a way that I've thought about it a lot is I have family members, close friends who happen to be gay, who I love dearly. They're important parts of my life. And I also support the court's ruling in this instance, where siding with protecting freedom of expression and speech, essentially to say that the state cannot coerce you to engage in a message that violates your core beliefs. So how can I articulate that position in a way that still shows love and respect for folks who may disagree or may have a lived experience that, as you said earlier, makes this issue tender for them? What's the right approach?
Well, Nick, I think you already have the right approach, because I can tell by the way you talk about your family that you have a loving heart. And that is the key. If you can share with whoever you're speaking to, even if you, especially if you disagree about this topic or another topic, if you can share your ideas and thoughts with love, and especially with a story, and ask for a story in return, then we can see how we have so much more in common than we disagree with. We all agree that family is important. So many of us agree that marriage is important, and we agree that freedom is important and that we should be respected to live our lives. So let's build on that, but let's do it with love.
Derek, love does not seem to enter into public policy debates very often. And so acknowledging that, how can it help be an antidote to the polarization around this issue?
Hey man, all you need is love. So no, I think the first step actually is a step back from these kinds of consideration, and have someone who is a close friend, maybe it's someone in your family, you kind of already have that connection, who is of a different mindset on these issues, who comes from a different background, maybe they're LGBT. So the perfect example in my life is Marian, right? A long friendship. Because what that allows you to do is to think about and see things from a different perspective as you come to know that person. So this isn't someone just who's on your, in your phone contacts. Like, this is someone you actually talk to regularly. And when you have that perspective, then you can start to actually think about this from their eyes, from what they've told you, from the stories or the experiences they've had, as well as your own. And when you think about communicating to that person, that is very, very important. So for example, and this is something that I think is actually true of the case, and a lot of people might disagree, but I think this ruling in 303 Creative actually supports LGBTQ equality in some important ways. For instance, in the same-sex marriage decision from the Supreme Court, the majority opinion said nothing about the same-sex marriage ruling prevents religious institutions or members of religious institutions from living and sharing their beliefs on marriage. If the court had ruled differently today, that would have actually been not true, because it would have basically been saying same-sex marriage actually requires you to check your faith at the door when it comes to the marketplace. And they said no. They kind of put proof to what the same-sex marriage ruling said. And so they didn't create a conflict where people are now having to say, well, does same-sex marriage mean I don't have free speech rights? They said no. Actually, you still have free speech rights. And so it doesn't require that conflict that then makes people start to question, do I really believe in same-sex marriage then? It avoids all of that and says that LGBTQ equality is something that can coexist with all the other rights out there that we have. And that's an important point that's probably not really being talked about on social media and in the news, because it's a bigger picture kind of perspective where, again, if you think about it from another perspective, another person's, walking in another person's shoes as much as you can start to recognize some of these realities and speak to them, because they are important. LGBTQ equality is important, and we need to protect that. And so how do we do that in a way that also protects everyone else? And that's what we're doing.
I want to pinpoint something you're saying that ties into another one of those really broad issues of polarization. That this issue, and even just as the case came out, glancing on Twitter and seeing what was said about it, yet again, like many issues, before it and that will come after, this creates an environment where the polarization that people feel towards one another is rampant. And it seems that if we can articulate a different narrative to say that, look, trying to lessen polarization and trying to have these kinds of empathetic, accommodating conversations, it doesn't weaken your own position to say that, well, I support religious freedom. I don't want to leave that. I think that's an important value that's embedded in what it means to be an American. But also supporting how can we have it exist in a society where others who disagree can still live their lives. So it strikes me as polarization makes these conversations harder. And I think part of that is because folks feel that, well, if I am not polarized, I am not as firm in my beliefs. And that seems just eminently wrong. You can articulate a strong position, in this case supporting free speech and religious expression, but in a way that reduces polarization. And it kind of seems to be what you're talking about, Derek, is this kind of zero-sum game mentality. Marian, you mentioned as well that with the court versus legislation, and there are other ways to accommodate these kinds of issues. So I wonder if you can just try and give a final word of encouragement to our listeners that it's okay for you and people in your family and your friend group in your lives to disagree on this issue, but there's a better way to do it that is more respectful towards one another that can in some ways help your position to strengthen. Any thoughts on what we can leave them with, that this isn't just a throw up our hands, society's polarized, everyone's mad at each other, I'm just going to ignore the issue. We need to kind of dig in, but do it in a different way. What have you seen in your life, in your experience, that can help inspire the rest of us to believe that that's possible?
What I've seen is my friend Laura, who was the reason that we were able to tackle youth homelessness in Utah. Laura has a very different view of same-sex marriage as I do, and we are dear, dear friends. So when I think about the web designer, I think about my friend Laura. Should Laura be compelled to say things against her belief? No. And Laura is the biggest advocate for LGBT youth that I know. So we can have both. It takes courage. It takes courage to live up to your beliefs and to act in love with people that you don't always agree with.
Derek, courage and love, again, words not associated with politics and policy, but final thoughts on how our listeners can incorporate that into their conversations.
Yeah, I think to echo kind of what Marian's story with Laura was, find that individual that you resonate with on a personal level, that is different than you, that thinks differently than you, lives differently than you, and get to know them, because that is where you will start to see things in a more depolarized way, which is actually the reality, right? Polarization is a way of deceiving people. Ultimately, that there's only two sides, and you can't have one and then the other at the same time. And when you actually start to see things from a different perspective, not only, by the way, does it help you see these realities, it enriches your life in so many different ways. My life would be less if I didn't know Marian. And that is something that frankly you probably won't understand until you actually start to make these connections with people. And then you start to recognize what your beliefs really do mean in the context of a broader, more complicated reality. And that's why they get stronger, because you're not going to let them go simply because you have a friend who's LGBT. You're actually going to recognize what they really mean and what they shouldn't mean, because the polarized world will tell you it means certain things that might harm that LGBT friend of yours. And you don't want that. And you start to you kind of reconcile your beliefs with those relationships. But again, that doesn't require you to let those go. It just means you actually hold them even more firmly, because you can do it in a way that actually supports and emboldens your LGBT friend, or vice versa. Your religious friend, or your Republican or Democrat friend. Pick your difference that you want to try to overcome. And those things, I think, are where that courage comes from, and where that love gets established, and where the firmness in your own beliefs then becomes unshakable.
Well, Derek Monson, Marian, Edmonds-Allen, thank you so much for joining us today. And just want to point out for our listeners that your relationship is in some ways a personal microcosm of the Utah Compromise, and this approach of we can accommodate one another, we can still hold true to our beliefs, but create space for where other people can live their lives without feeling like we're letting go of ideas or principles that we feel are very important to ourselves and to the founding of this country. So I just want to thank you both for your ongoing work and your friendship and relationship, And for our listeners, we will continue to share content like this, and especially Derek and Marian often write pieces together, appear at events together. I encourage you to go and follow them to learn more about their relationship interaction. So thank you again for joining us here on Defending Ideas.
Thank you, Nick.
Glad to be here.
We have one more break before we wrap up for today's episode. We will leave you with some final talking points solidified to help you in your conversations. Once again, you're listening to Defending Ideas. We'll be right back. Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org. Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, just a couple key thoughts. First, this really is a tender issue, as we talked about with one of our guests, and as such, all of our conversations about it should be grounded in love and mutual respect for one another, no matter which side of the issue we come down on. Secondly, the key takeaway is that you can defend the principle of speech and free expression, which in this case means the government can't coerce you to convey a message that you disagree with. You can defend that principle in a way that extends love and respect to others, even if they disagree, and that we can create space for all Americans to live their lives and remain true to their convictions. We hope you enjoyed this episode and that you feel better equipped to defend the ideas we talked about today. If you enjoyed the episode, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to the podcast on any of the major podcast platforms. You can also find shareable clips that you can use in your discussions with friends and family online. Thank you again for listening to Defending Ideas, where we are renewing the principles of common sense conservatism. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nick Dunn. We'll see you next time.